Welcome to the webinar. Today we are going to be talking about how to back up and restore your Jira configuration. So leveraging DevOps and Salto for Jira. And we're excited to have you here. My name is Scott Dixon. I'm a customer engineer here at Salto. I'm based in New York, and I work with our customers to help them onboard and implement with Salto and to make the most out of the platform. So I'm excited to get started with you all here today. So just a little bit of background about Salto. Salto is a platform to help you manage other SaaS applications. So as you're probably well aware, the modern companies have a number of SaaS applications, Jira, the Atlassian stack being one of them, Salesforce, NetSuite, Zendesk. There's a number of SaaS applications that you might be handling. Now, all of these apps require a deep level of customization to make sure that they're going to work right for the specific processes that your organization has in place. Because they need a lot of customization, and because this might be these applications are leveraged by both a combination of technical and non-technical audiences, a lot of no-code or low-code tools are used throughout the IT and business app stack, which is great because it does make it quite easy to configure these applications, but these come with a number of challenges of their own. I'm sure for all of the Jira admins on this call, you understand that making a change here sometimes can be a little bit tricky to figure out what is the impact of that change elsewhere in the environment. And that's why we developed Salto. It's a DevOps tool for IT and business applications like Jira. We're able to adapt the best practices and tools from DevOps into how business and IT applications are managed. So here I am in my Salto environment that I'm connected to a number of different Jira environments. Now, in this case, I'm connected to a sandbox instance and a production instance. Just to kind of give you a little bit of background on Salto, how it works. As soon as you connect and authenticate to Salto, it runs a fetch to pull down all of the configuration metadata. Now, this fetch is really important because not only does it give you insight into how you can see where different configurations are being used, for example, where a field is being referenced across the environment, the dependencies of a workflow, the dependencies of automation, and so on. But you can also use that as a snapshot to restore just in case you were to have anything happen in production. So I have my production instance here. I've already been running a number of fetches on it. By the way, in Salto, a fetch can be ran on a schedule. So that's hourly, daily, weekly. You can also run them manually at any time. Every single time that fetch runs, I use a feature in Salto called monitoring, which is over here in the settings. And this is the specific monitor I have set up. I've got it set up so that anytime an automation or a workflow is deleted, it's going to send me an email directly to my email address. You can also configure this to send to a Slack thread, or you can configure this to send to a group email or a number of different emails. And it's going to send me a notification if it detects that a change has been made in Jira directly. Later on, I'll show you how you can also make changes using Salto, but this use case, we're focused on users that are making changes in production directly. So if Salto detects that a change has been made, that is the deletion of a workflow or deletion of automation in Jira directly, it's going to send me an email. Now, actually, I got an email earlier today saying that an automation and a workflow configuration have been deleted. So this is a great feature in Salto. It allows you to get immediate feedback about key changes that are being made in production. So I get a list of the elements, and then I can also get a detailed report. Now, in this case, it's showing as all red because essentially it's getting deleted. But if you were to have this set up for a modification, it would show you a side-by-side of what exactly was modified as part of that alert that gets sent out. Now, coming back here to Salto, let's say that if I take a look at this automation and this workflow, I want to restore those. I didn't mean to delete that, or maybe I did at the time mean to delete that, but now I need that automation and that workflow back ASAP. So it's pretty easy to do in Salto. Let me show how you can do it. So I'm in my production environment here. And under compare and deploy, I can switch this to restore to your previous version. So this begins that restore flow. Now, as I begin this flow, you'll notice that I have a number of different timestamps that are being represented here. So these represent the individual fetches that are ran in Salto. Remember, I said that they can be run on a schedule, hourly, daily, weekly. They can also be run manually at any time, which is why you see a lot of different timestamps here. I've ran this fetch manually a few times earlier today. Now, I know in this case that the last time that these configurations existed in this environment was at about 8 a.m. So I want to go ahead and do a comparison of my current state versus the snapshot taken at 8:22 p.m. 8 a.m. Sorry. So I'm going to go ahead and create this deployment, and now Salto is going to instantly show me all of the changes that it detects from now until that time at 8:22 a.m. Now, if I go to this element selection, basically it's saying that if I want to revert back to that previous time, I can go ahead and choose all. Now I can go ahead and choose all of these if I want to do a complete rollback, or I can review the changes. So here is that automation. So I want to go ahead and re-add that automation. Here is the field and the field context that the automation was using. So I want to go ahead and add that. And in this case, it looks like this workflow. Now, I don't want to do a full rollback. I actually meant to delete that workflow. So I want to go ahead and leave that unchecked. But I have a number of other changes. It looks like there was a workflow that was updated. Someone removed a transition. I need to revert back. And I need to also update the field configuration. So again, getting everything back to how it was at 8:22 a.m. Now I've gone ahead and selected all the elements. Now I selected some of the elements. I'm not doing a full rollback here. So I'm ready to go ahead and move forward with the deployment process in Salto. Now, after the deployment preview step, Salto is going to analyze all the changes and allow you to, it's going to highlight any potential issues with restoring those changes. But assuming there are no changes, I'll be able to push it forward and get those changes deployed into production. Now, going back to the poll, it looks like almost everyone was able to answer. Interestingly enough, so have you or a colleague ever deleted a configuration in production? So about 46% of you said yes, and 54% of you said not yet. So hopefully that thing that was deleted in production, you were able, was something that you meant to do, or you were able to get back to a working state quickly as possible. But as you can see here with Salto, if you were to ever delete anything in production, it's as easy as creating a deployment, selecting the elements, and if I were to go ahead and click deploy, it would go ahead and deploy the field configurations, the fields, the automation, and the workflow changes right back to where I was at 8 a.m. this morning. So I'm going to go ahead and deploy these changes. So when I click deploy now, it's going to push those changes back into production and get all of those configurations exactly like they were at that time. Now, the great thing about this is that as part of doing this restore process using Salto, is that I'm going to get automatic documentation of that change that was pushed. So if I come back to the compare, actually, let me just wait just a couple seconds here. This deployment should be done, and it's going to show me a history of this deployment. So I will always have in Salto a history of that deployment that was done to restore my environment back to that state. If I come back to the history tab here, this is where you're going to be able to see a history of all the deployments that were done. Now, the example here I was showing was how to restore a configuration that was being that had been deleted or misconfigured in production. Something it looks like some of you are already leveraging in Salto, or in Jira, is a sandbox. So if you are leveraging a sandbox in Jira, that's something that Salto can help you with. Since usually using a sandbox can kind of de-risk making those changes in production, because you're able to make those changes in sandbox, test them, and then push them to production. So I want to show an example about how you can do that using Salto. So if I come back to the compare and deploy using Salto, This workflow, or sorry, this flow here in Salto, basically you select a source and a target environment. In this case, I am selecting my sandbox because that's where my this workflow that I want to push up to production exists, and I need to push that up to production. So that's why I choose the target environment. And I'm going to call this add new workflow, since that's what I'm going to do as part of this deployment. Now, also, one of my questions was, how do you document changes made to production? So about 54% of you said that you use Jira tickets or some sort of ticket management platform to track the changes being made. About 69% of you are using Confluence. Now, this was a multi-choice, which is why the numbers don't necessarily add up to 100%. About 8% of you are using a spreadsheet, and then about 8% rely on the audit logs. So if you are using something like a ticket management platform, if you're using Jira itself to track the changes, this is a great way to attach the ticket to the title of a deployment here in Salto. And through the deployment process, every step along the way is going to get documented automatically back to that Jira ticket. So if I were to add in this particular deployment, I want to add this workflow to production. So I would select this particular deployment, or sorry, this particular workflow. It's called Update Team. As soon as I select it, because Salto understands the full context of not only the environment that we're pushing to, but the environment that we're pushing from, it's going to flag any potential dependencies. In this case, it's flagging a required dependency because one of the statuses that's being referred to as as part of this workflow, called on hold, doesn't yet exist in the target environment. Whereas if I look under additional dependencies, there's a number of changes to existing elements that exist in both environments. And this is where Salto is going to flag them, but they're not required. Now, this is a bit different. If anyone has used any migration tools that in the Jira ecosystem, many times what they will do is they will take an entire configuration and push all the updates to the target environment, which will leave you with a lot of duplicate fields or maybe even overwriting fields that you didn't mean to do in the first place. Salto works very differently than this. While we will flag the required dependencies, in other words, like the fields and statuses that just simply don't exist yet in the target environment, for anything that does exist in that target environment, we are going to flag them as a related change and not require you to actually make those changes. Now, of course, you can review them and still include those changes, but this is a great way to kind of prevent that technical debt because you're not adding to the complexity of the environment simply by doing a deployment. Now, at this stage, I can go ahead and move forward with the deployment process. It's going to take the changes that I've queued up, pulling from taking that workflow from sandbox, pushing it to production, taking all the dependencies, and make sure that these are changes that we are going to be able to make to the target environment. Now, earlier, we had actually asked you all for some questions ahead of time. There was a question from Zoe: can Salto be used to push configuration changes from sandbox to production? So this is the exact flow that you could use to push your configurations from sandbox up to production using Salto. So here I've got my deployment is now ready to go. I've got that particular workflow. I've got that particular status. No issues are raised. Now I can go ahead and deploy these changes if I would like. And now I've initiated this deployment. So in probably just a couple of seconds here, it's going to complete that deployment, and I will get that workflow and that status pushed to production. So if I come back to the compare and deploy under the history, now it doesn't matter if I've done a restore or I've done a comparison between like sandbox and production and pushed a configuration from production, but I'm going to be able to see all of the changes that I've made in production right here in Salto. Now, this could be really helpful, especially if you ever need to revert a deployment. So let's say that I make a change to a workflow, I add some transitions, I remove some transitions, they don't quite act as expected, and I need to revert that. Using Salto, it's very easy. All you have to do is select the particular deployment, select revert, and then Salto will then run a kind of like a reverse deployment, where it's going to take all the changes that were pushed and do the reverse. So if you added something, removed it, if you modified it, get it back to that previous state. So using Salto in combination with your sandbox and having the revert capabilities, as well as the ability to restore to a previous version, that's going to get you, that's going to remove a lot of the risk of making those changes in production. I wanted to ask if anyone had any, as a reminder, if anyone has any questions, please drop them in the Q&A. We also have a chat. Feel free to drop them in chat. And I'm sorry, I think someone raised their hand earlier, but I might have missed it because I was sharing my screen at the time. So if you want to drop your question in chat or Q&A, we'll make sure to get right to that. Now, one thing I wanted to show in Salto as well is the ability to be able to look at the entire environment and see how everything ties together. So this is available as soon as you run that fetch, and that fetch is the same thing that's serving as a snapshot that you can use to restore from. It's also you can use that to explore the current state of the environment. So under the Explore tab, you can see a outline of your folder in this folder-like structure. You can see the outline of everything that's set up in the environment. You'll be able to see, for example, all the projects. Now, one thing to note is that Salto does support both service projects, JSM projects, or software projects, and we'll be able to display them in the same type of folder view. So for example, I've got this software project called XOZ, and I'll be able to see all the schemes tied to it. I'll be able to see where it's being referenced and so on. Now, it also works the other way. So let's say that I wanted to take a look at one of these automations. I can also see the dependencies of an automation. So I'd be able to see exactly what the automations depend on. So question from Andrew, for how many days does Salto keep the previous version history? That's a great question. So there's kind of a couple ways to think about it. If I go to the compare and deploy and I'm looking at restore to a previous version, right now we're going to kind of keep the versions for, I believe it's about a quarter. That might change. It really depends on, it kind of depends on the plan for now, but for right now, we at least keep it for a quarter. But of course, this is going to be as granular as the fetches that you're making. So if you're making them hourly, we'll be able to keep them down to the hourly rate if you do them daily or weekly. So it just depends on how granular you would like to get. Question from Augusto. When you restore a workflow or automation to production, does it pause these functions till it completes? And what occurs to any new tickets created during the restore process? That's a great question. So if you were to restore a workflow or automation to production, the way that it would, so if I talk about an automation, it's going to wait until it completes and then activates it again. Now for the workflow, it depends if you are just restoring the workflow or if you're also adding it to a scheme, which might need to be published in Jira directly. When you are updating a workflow in Salto, sometimes you might need to go ahead and publish that draft scheme in Jira directly. We'll give you a notification after the deployment is done, just to let you know when to do that. And then what occurs to any new tickets created during the restore process? So basically, if someone were to remove an automation or workflow in production, and then you use Salto to basically create or recreate that workflow or automation, in terms of what Jira will see, they will see a brand new automation and a brand new workflow being created. So it's going to be assigned a brand new internal ID from the Jira side. So I believe I believe what would happen was it would only be after the workflow or the automation is unpaused, and then it would start taking the new tickets. But I have to double check. I'm not really sure off the top of my head. And got a question in the Q&A. So the Atlassian Marketplace lists Salto as free. Is this accurate? And if so, why? Why are you giving away this project away? Great question, actually. So there is a free aspect to Salto. If you use Salto today, what you see under the Explore tab in terms of being able to pull down all the configuration metadata and see all of the relationships between all those elements in Salto, this is really helpful for analyzing, potential impact of the changes. This for one environment, that's part of our free tier. So I believe that's why the marketplace listing lists this as a free option, because we do have that free option. Now we also have a free trial. The free trial, you can come to salto.io, start a free trial, and you'll be able to use the full platform. So you'll be able to connect to multiple environments, you'll be able to deploy, you'll be able to restore from backup, and that's part of our paid tier. Also during the trial period, at the end of the trial period, you'll be given a prompt in the UI letting you know that the trial period is ended, and you can always downgrade to the free tier. And the free tier does include this section just for the one environment. Salto for Cloud hasn't been updated. We have to. I need to double check about that. There's a question about the update date being shown on the marketplace. I believe those numbers might be slightly out of date. We've definitely updated both. I mean, we actually had a release of our latest version of the Jira adapter yesterday, so we need to double check to see why those numbers are looking the way that they do. Another question, any plans for adding user management features? So finding all projects a specific user has access to. That's a great question. So for right now, and actually this is a great place to share with you all the supported Jira types. I'm going to put this in the chat. This is a list of all these supported types that you can fetch and deploy using Salto. Now you'll notice that none of this includes the user data, and none of this includes issue data. So for right now, because we're not fetching specific users, you wouldn't necessarily be able to find all the projects a specific user has access to. However, we do fetch groups, and that is something you can get information within Salto, so you can see which projects a specific group has. We also fetch like permission schemes, so you can see updates made to the permission schemes. And then question from Darlene, are you planning or do you have anything related to PII tracking? And that is, so Darlene, let me know if I misunderstood the question. Some of it actually is related to what I just mentioned about how Salto is only pulling in the configuration metadata. So we're not pulling in users for right now. So we don't pull in any PII. But I would love to hear maybe a little bit more about your use case to see if it's something we might be doing in the future. And sorry, Darlene, hopefully I answered that question for you. If not, we can always follow up and make sure that we get your full use case and get that question answered for you. Another question, does this also support third-party app configurations in Jira? So right now, and this is also listed in our supported Jira types at the bottom, right now the add-ons that we support are just script runner. And then you can see what we support in Jira Cloud versus Jira DC in terms of script runner. We would look to add more. It's all based off of customer and user demand. So please let us know if you have any key plugins that you're configuring a lot, especially if you're configuring these third-party applications both in Sandbox and in production. And we can make sure that we let our product team know about this. But yeah, for right now, it's going to be these configurations as well as script runner. Now, the great thing about if you are leveraging something like a script runner is that Salto is going to be able to track all the references within script runner made to other configurations, meaning that you don't need to update the reference to the IDs because Salto is holding that reference. And when you do the deploy, Salto can just automatically update during the deployment process. Before implementing Salto is the best practice to is the best starting point to back up prod to the sandbox and then use Salto going forward? That's a great question, and I think that is definitely one way to do it. We have customers doing that exact what you're talking about. They do a refresh to the sandbox and start using Salto going forward. I think that's the cleanest way to go forward. Obviously, you can't always do that. Now, one little trick in Salto that's super helpful is, let me just show you really quickly. If I do another comparison between sandbox and production, I'll just call this new comparison, is that you can actually use Salto ahead of a sandbox refresh to identify anything that's sitting there in sandbox that could potentially be wiped out by doing a refresh. So this is what usually what I recommend is trying to figure out a good refresh structure, refresh cadence, and then ahead of that, using Salto to identify any of basically everything in the additions tab to make sure that we get all of that development out of sandbox before doing that refresh. And please keep the questions coming. We have about an hour for the webinar. However, I don't necessarily have an hour's worth of content, so I'm happy to answer as many questions as you all have for me. Is there a size limit to backing up a full instance with attachments? Augusto, great question. I'm gonna have to double check. I don't think there is, but I don't want to give you a wrong answer. Also, there was a question earlier, by the way, someone was asking about how long does Salto hold those backups over time. So I answered specifically about the backups that you can use to automatically restore with Salto. Now, that being said, Salto can also hook up to a Git repository. If you're familiar with Git, it's a version control system usually used for software. But because Salto is turning all of your configurations into a flat file structure, it allows us to treat your configurations as if they were code, which means we can basically create versions over time and commit them up to Git. Now, when you're doing a deployment with Salto, it's going to automatically push that change up to a branch that you have in your connected Git repository that represents those changes. Let me just show you an example. This was one of the deployments that I just did. And now I can see kind of the file representation of what those configurations were that I added in that case. In this case, this was that deployment that I just did where I added a workflow and I added this particular status. So I can always come back and review these changes. In addition, you can also document changes that are made ad hoc. So if I click preview push, I can see that looks like someone removed this workflow configuration. I also got an alert about this, by the way, in that chain. So I could say that, this is related to, maybe another ticket here. I could push that change up and still get that change documented. Now, in terms of when you get this pushed up to Git, that Git repository is a Git repository that would be on your end. And so that is just limited to whatever your agreement with GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, and so on would be. It would be your Git repository. So there's no kind of limit on the history there. All right, got another question. Is Salto comparable with discovery projects and/or Trello boards? So I don't think with either, but thanks for the question. I'm going to check to see if we have identified that yet as an area to work on. Yeah, just as a reminder, I'm going to put this in the chat once more because I know we've had a couple of messages since then. These are all of the types that we currently support, but we'd love to hear from you, especially if you have any third-party plugins that you're managing, you're changing a lot, especially if you're managing them both in Sandbox and production. We'd love to hear a little bit more about that. All right, so question, for dependencies during deployment, does it understand a field's workflow status is being used in automations or other configurations? Yes. Yeah, so if I go back to the compare and deploy flow, I believe I have another configuration I can show you here that's sitting there in Sandbox. I'll call this deployment test. So if I were to add, I believe this automation, let's check. Of course, I'm trying to find an automation that is looking at a field that doesn't yet exist in my so it actually came up on my earlier configuration that I added. But basically, if you select like a workflow or an automation that is being that has a dependency on a field or a status that doesn't yet exist in the target environment, that will be flagged as a missing or required dependency. And Salto is going to prompt you along the way to make sure that you add that. All right, another question. If we need to restore tickets for different reasons, so deleted, does it restore the ticket to the previous state along with any comments, attachments have been on that ticket? Yeah, great question, Augusto. So Salto is aimed at backing up and restoring configurations. So Salto does not pull in ticket data or user data. There are a couple applications out there. We have a number of customers that are using Salto for the backup of their configuration. And then they also have a backup for the issue data. Now the issue data tends to have, very sensitive, or it can have quite sensitive information in it. So we stick just to the configurations. But for our customers that use Salto for backing up their configurations and then another tool for backing up their issues, typically what will happen is they will use Salto to restore the configurations and then use the other tool to do the to restore the backup from the data perspective to make sure that all the issues are back. What happens if a configuration with the same name already exists in the target instance but doesn't match exactly what I intend to deploy? Great question. Does it override the data? Yeah. So the way the Salto at a very, very high level, the way that Salto is identifying field statuses, workflows, automations, pretty much everything across environments, is it's using some sort of a unique identifier, typically the name of the element. So let's use a field, for example. So we've got a field called Scott's Field that exists in Sandbox, and we've got Scott's Field that exists in production. Salto is going to see that and recognize that as the same field, even though it has two different IDs. In terms of one has the internal ID of maybe 1, 2, 3 on Sandbox, and it's got 4, 5, 6 in production. Now, the way that Salto is fetching and representing these configurations is Salto is referring to the field in Sandbox and production, which means that during the deployment process, if there's any place where we actually need to hard code in that exact ID, Salto can automatically interpolate it. All that being said, if the configuration with the same name exists in the target environment, but it doesn't match exactly what you intend to deploy. So let's say maybe there's an automation. There's an automation that has the exact same name, but there's some changes. So what it would show in Salto is that there's a number of modifications. Now you can be let me see if I can show you an example here within Salto. Let's see, it's not a great example. Here's an example where I've got a workflow that exists in Sandbox and production. Now, if you can see that these little checkboxes next to each of these changes, Salto will allow you to be kind of particular about which changes you want to deploy up into. But if it has the same name in both environments, Salto will recognize it as the same element, and then allow you to choose which modifications do you actually want to deploy up. But it won't do that unless you select it. And if you select it, it won't create a duplicate. It would essentially, override it to make it look the same as it was in Sandbox, but only if you've selected those changes. Question, does Salto have any limitations or considerations when it comes to team managed project configurations? Great question. So for right now, due to some complexities of the APIs around team managed projects, we don't fetch or deploy those team managed projects today. So if you do have any of those in terms of Salto, you wouldn't actually see those within Salto. But let us know if you've got a large number of projects that are team managed projects. We're trying to keep track of that. Monitor your configurations. Is there a way to batch email notifications instead of sending notification for each change? That's I think Vijay, that was a question from you. Great question. So right now it sends a notification for each change, but I love what you're saying here. So I'm going to get that feedback back to our product team. I think that makes a ton of sense. Does it give the user information related to who made the change? So that's a great question. So for right now, no, we're not getting. So we are pulling in most of this from a combination of private and public APIs that are available through Atlassian. Not all of those give us the details about who actually made that change. That being said, remember how I said that Salto works for a number of different business applications like NetSuite, Zendesk, Salesforce, and so on. In some of those applications, they do give us who made that change. And so because of that, you'll see listed in this table a little changed by, and so it will show you who actually made that change. So hopefully this answers your question, Vijay, but the answer is right now, we don't give you that user information just because it's not available yet. But as soon as it's available from the APIs, then we plan on adding that. Awesome, and please keep the questions coming. And while I wait for a couple questions, I just wanted to share the final results of the poll. Have you or another colleague ever deleted a configuration production? So 43% yes, 57% not yet. Do you use a sandbox? We've got about 21% of folks yes, and they're using it to make almost before any change made to production, which is great. And then about 36% of you said that you do use a sandbox instance, but only before making a major change to production. And then 43% of you said you're not using a Jira sandbox. So if you're not and are interested in using a Jira sandbox, Salto can really help you with that process to make it a lot easier to actually move those changes. And then on the question of how do you document changes made to production, this one we had a pretty widespread, but looks like 60% of you are using Jira tickets to document. 67% of you also use something like a Confluence to document changes. 7% are using a spreadsheet, and about 7% rely on the audit logs. Another question, Vijay, is there a way to schedule a deployment? This might help admins make changes in the sandbox and push them to production at the end of the day or week. So great question, Vijay. That is definitely something you can do with Salto. I didn't get into it in this particular demonstration, but essentially what you can do within Salto is remember how I showed that you could hook into something like a GitHub or a GitLab through the version control because we're pushing up changes. This is also something you can do as part of the deployment process. So if I were to, let me just show you a quick demonstration here. I might get some errors here, but that's fine. So during the deployment preview, basically what you can do is turn the entire deployment into a pull request and then send that pull request over to something like GitHub or GitLab. And then we can use their tools like GitHub Actions or GitLab CI to then automate that. We do have some customers that are doing exactly what you said, where they will queue up deployments being made to production where they will run. And then let me just take a look at this particular pull request. And then using something like a GitHub Actions, for every pull request that is opened, it will then, you can use this to then schedule Salto to automatically run. We have a CLI tool that you can run through something like a GitHub Actions, and it will schedule that deployment to run. And I'll make sure that we get you all some information about that as well. It's definitely available in Salto. It's a kind of some of our more advanced functionality that some of our customers are leveraging, but it's the great thing about Salto is you can get started today with fetching your configuration. You automatically then get a backup that you can use to restore to at any time, and then over time you can start to introduce more complex change management solutions like automating and scheduling the deployments. I think I've reached the end. Well, the end of the questions so far, but if anyone else has any questions, please feel free to drop us a line. Now, if you think of a question later on, please, we will send you some follow-up, so please respond and we'll make sure to get your answers out there. I've also made a note of a few of you had some questions that I need to follow up on, and we will definitely follow up after the call. Oh, and also check out the chat in the last link if you're interested on doing like a one-on-one demo with Salto. Go to that link. It's got a little bit more information about how you can book a demo. A couple more questions. If a user account is restricted or has basic permissions on the production, but has temporary administrative privileges on the sandbox for making specific changes, does the system recognize that the user is unable to push changes to production? So in other words, a user is basically an admin in sandbox, and they are not an admin in prod. How would that work in Salto? So that would actually work totally fine in Salto. This is something that you can configure. Let me just show you really quickly under the application connections. So by default, what we do here in Salto is that you have a set of team credentials that's used to fetch all the configuration metadata. That should be the same because you want everyone to have access to that same pool of configuration metadata. And then each user would set up their own credentials in order to actually deploy into that environment. Now, if they don't have the ability to actually deploy into production, this is something we would recommend like a service account. And then you can actually set up an approval process. This is also related to some of the advanced functionality that I was talking about, where you can turn the deployment into a pull request. But essentially what you can do is you restrict who can actually deploy into production, and then you can make sure that only the users that are able to deploy into production do. Dark mode. Question: do we have a dark mode? We do. Let me just double check. Yes, we do. So it's under the settings. I actually didn't realize that until today. So yes, we do have a dark mode. So if there are no other questions, we'll probably wrap up here soon. But feel free, love to answer any questions. Is there a limit on the number of application connections? So great question. So this application connections is more about the connection to the application within an environment in Salto. Let me kind of take a step back. What I mean by environment is the individual connection from one environment in Salto to one environment in Jira. So in this case, it's like a sandbox environment or your production environment. And that's what this application connections is taking a look at. There's no, in terms of the number of environments that you're configured in Salto, there's no limit necessarily. Now that kind of gets into some licensing and pricing. We price per production instance, but not for sandboxes. So no technical limit, but it is part of our licensing. So any other questions? Thank you everyone for attending. Thanks for all the great questions, and we will send everyone out a copy of the recording, as well as some of these helpful links. And for those of you that ask questions, we'll make sure we'll follow up once we get a confirmation on the answers. And if you have any questions after the call, please reach out to us. Thank you again.